It is custom before we give a Dhamma talk to pay respect to the Buddha. Please repeat with me. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Today's talk is called Is This the Dhamma Vinaya? Because what we call Buddhism consists of many teachings of many kinds, and very many of those teachings are incompatible. And many people are unable really to decide what is what, because incompatible teachings cannot be all the Buddha's teachings, because the Buddha's teachings are all coherent. The Buddha compares his teachings to a cloth where there are no holes or anything. And this problem the Buddha foresaw, because the Buddha foresaw that 500 years after his parinibbana, then a new fake Dhamma would appear, and that would be the beginning of the gradual deterioration of the true Dhamma. Right? The true Dhamma is a Saddhamma. So from about 500 years after his parinibbana, things started to go downhill. And as the Buddha explains in a sutta, the sasana disappears only because fake dhammas appear and corrupt the true Dhamma. To try to delay this deterioration, the Buddha gave the bhikkhus some guidelines on what to do, and those guidelines are given in what's called the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. And the Mahaparinibbana Sutta is a long sutta in the Digha Nikaya, which describes the last days of the Buddha. Please read aloud. The Buddha gave these 4 references for us to try to decide what is and what is not the true Dhamma. A reference is something we refer to find out whether, right, we have one thing, we refer to something else to check it. And the first reference the Buddha gave to the bhikkhus is reference to the Buddha, and he explained. Please read aloud. Sorry. The first great reference is reference to the Buddha. But as we can see, the Buddha himself makes the Buddha's word depend on reference to the Dhamma, the suttas and Vinaya. This is what the Buddha means when he says the Dhamma is independent of the Buddha. The Buddha himself takes the Dhamma as his reference. Just after the Buddha's enlightenment, he reflected, it is dukkha not to have someone to pay respect to. And so with his Buddha eye, the Buddha looked out into the world to find someone who was superior to him in morality and superior to him in wisdom, but he could find nobody. So he decided that he would pay respect to the Dhamma. Right? He would honor the Dhamma, he would live in dependence on the Dhamma. And as we could see, the first great reference, it is called reference to the Buddha, but in reality it is reference to the Dhamma, Vinaya, the suttas and the Vinaya. So today we have the Pali texts. They are the Buddha Vachana, because the Buddha has passed away. And if we want to decide what is the true Dhamma, we should not depend on historical data, we should not depend on facts about the Buddha, facts about the Pali texts, about other texts or any such thing, because such reference is just speculation. It is the domain of academia, the subjects of history, linguistics, etc. So we should leave those things alone, because they do not help to increase our faith. They help to decrease our faith, and they are irrelevant. Then, after this first great reference, the Buddha gives the second great reference, which is reference to Asanga. Here again, the Buddha says what that bhikkhu tells us we should then reconcile with the suttas and relate to the Vinaya. And if it doesn't conform, we should reject it. If it does, we should accept it. So again, the veracity of those teachings depends on reference to the Pali text. They do not depend on the individual communities' practices, their customs, etc. And then we have the third great reference, which is reference to several elders. Here again, the Buddha explains, whatever they teach should be reconciled with the suttas, set in relation to the Vinaya. If it doesn't agree, it should be rejected. If it does agree, we should accept it. And so again, the veracity of the Buddha's words depends on the Pali texts, not on the elder bhikkhus, however senior they are, however famous they are. Then we take the last reference, the fourth great reference. Here again, the Buddha tells us these teachings should be related to the suttas and the Vinaya. If they do not conform, we should reject it. If the teaching does conform, we should accept it. Again, reference to the Pali text, not to the elder bhikkhu, however senior he is, however learned he is, however famous he is. Then, as we can see, in each case the Buddha talks about being learned, because throughout the suttas and the Vinaya, the Buddha makes it very, very clear that if we want to refer to the four great references, if we want to undertake this reconciling with the suttas and the Vinaya, then we need to be well familiar with the Pali texts. We need to be well familiar with the Pali texts in their entirety. In some cases, of course, it requires only elementary learning to understand that a certain teaching cannot be referred to the suttas and Vinaya. For example, it doesn't require very much learning to understand that a bhikkhu cannot, should not accept, possess or use money under any form. Right? Such knowledge, such understanding is common knowledge among common civilized people throughout the world. And also, we don't need to be very, very learned in the suttas and Vinaya to understand that a bhikkhu and a samanera, they must respect and be very scrupulous about their practice with regard to every precept laid down by the Buddha. But then there are more serious cases, more subtle cases, where if we want to refer to the four great references, we need to be of great learning, we need to be versed in the doctrine, we need to be masters of the Dhamma, masters of the Vinaya, masters of the matrices. Masters of the matrices does not refer to the Abhidharma, Masters of the Matrices refers to the Bhikkhu Patimokkha and the Bhikkhuni Patimokkha. So, if we want to undertake a reconciliation of a teaching that we have heard with the Suttas and Vinaya, we need to have seriously undertaken and in a proper way, with a proper qualified teacher, the threefold higher training, the higher morality, the higher concentration, and the higher wisdom. We need either to have undertaken it or we need to have completed it. Otherwise, it's very difficult to be qualified to make those reconciliations between the teaching that we have heard and then the teachings as they are laid down by the Buddha. And it was such bhikkhus, learned bhikkhus, versed in the doctrine, masters of the Dhamma, masters of the Vinaya, masters of the matrices, such learned bhikkhus in the past, they would take the individual sutta and then they would refer it to the teachings as a whole in order to show future generations of bhikkhus how to understand the suttas. They composed commentaries for the various teachings. And then, as you no doubt know, one Indian bhikkhu called the Venerable Buddhaghosa, I won't go into the history of it, but he then compiled the many commentaries that existed and made a commentary for each collection of suttas. And the teachers that taught the commentaries to the suttas, they are what we call the venerable teachers of the commentaries, Atthakatthacharya, right? They were of great learning, versed in the doctrine, masters of the Dhamma, masters of the Vinaya, masters of the matrices. Then we may ask, why were the commentaries deemed necessary? Because in a sutta, the Buddha does not give the details that are necessary for practice of his teachings. That is the nature of suttas. There's, for example, the very famous Mahasatipatthana Sutta. If we read the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, we will discover that it's actually a very short sutta. It's very brief. There are no practical explanations. Yes, the Buddha says the bhikkhu goes to the forest and sits down, crosses his leg, but that's as far as it goes. The Buddha does not, in the sutta, give practical details of how we develop mindfulness of breathing. Right? He doesn't say anywhere where one watches the breath. He just says he breathes in, he breathes out. He knows the in-breath, he knows the out-breath. Through the mouth, through the nose. How does he know? It's not explained in the sutta. So, in reality, it's impossible to practice mindfulness of breathing if one refers only to the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, because there's no practical details. In the same way, the Buddha does not explain how we develop jhana with mindfulness of breathing. Not in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, but in another sutta, the Buddha gives the same instructions for Anapanasati, and then he explains how the bhikkhu develops it up to the first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana. But the Buddha doesn't explain how. He just explains that the bhikkhu attains the first jhana, is associated with happiness and joy, etc., and then the second jhana. He doesn't explain in any whatsoever way how you develop jhana with mindfulness of breathing. In many suttas, the Buddha talks about the practice of metta up to jhana. Read those suttas. There are no practical details. Nothing. No practical details about how to develop karuna, compassion. No practical details about how to develop mudita, sympathetic joy. No practical details about how to develop upekkha, equanimity. And no practical details about how to develop the 10 kasinas. The Buddha mentions the 10 kasinas in the suttas, not a single detail. We have no idea what to do if we look at only the suttas. If we look at the suttas, we don't even know what a kasina is, right? Because there's just no explanation at all. Then we can take another example of what we don't know by looking only at the suttas. The Buddha's first teaching was the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. We can translate it as the Dhamma Wheel Setting in Motion Sutta. This sutta the Buddha taught to the 5 ascetics whom he had formerly practiced austerities with. When the Buddha taught the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, one of those ascetics, the Venerable Anyakondanya, became a Sotapanna, a stream enterer, at the end of the sutta. 5 days later, when the other 4 ascetics had become stream enterers, the Buddha taught them the Anattalakkana Sutta, the non-self-characteristic sutta. At the end of that sutta, all 5 became arahants. Right, so there are 5 days. And then we can ask ourselves, what took place during those 5 days, right? The 5 days between the teaching of the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta and then the Anattalakkana Sutta. You can read it aloud. This is from the Aryapariyesana Sutta. Now I'll ask you a question. Who does not go for alms? Why? What? He's teaching. Is he just teaching a few hours a day? Or what do you think? Is he just giving a few instructions and then he goes and has a rest, waits for the food to come? So? What? Well, you can guess it. The Buddha is teaching full time, right? Because not even 5 bhikkhus go for Pindabhata. Only 2 go, and then 3. Why? Why doesn't he let all 5 go? What? Yes, it's continuous. It's continuous instruction, right? No time to spare, but they need food. And so, okay, we take a few, go and get food quickly, come back. Very intensive practice. Right? The Buddha is teaching full time, and the bhikkhus are practicing full time. Now, what was he teaching? He doesn't explain that anywhere, nowhere. That's all he explains, and it's not explained in any sutta. You can't find what he taught in any sutta anywhere. Why not? Because that is not the nature of suttas. It is not sutta material. It is explained in the commentary to the sutta. But we know, right, we are all very clever here, right? We all know that the Buddha must have been teaching samatha and vipassana. How do we know? Because the Buddha says if you want to attain nibbana, you have to practice samatha vipassana. Okay, so right, that's an inference we can make. Because samatha vipassana are the 4th noble truth, the noble truth of the practice leading to the cessation of suffering. We'll just make sure you remember. This is from the Mahasalayatanika Sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya. The Buddha says samatha and vipassana need to be developed by direct knowledge. You can study the Tipitaka until you're blue in the face. There is no sutta where the Buddha explains vipassana is this, blah 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 blah. There is no sutta in the Tipitaka where the Buddha explains samatha is this, 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 this. It's not possible by just looking at the suttas to know what is vipassana, because it's not explained in any sutta. Right? It doesn't mean the Buddha doesn't explain vipassana in the suttas. It doesn't mean the Buddha doesn't explain samatha in the suttas. But there's no sutta where he makes the connection between the word samatha and a practice, or the word vipassana and a practice. Either he mentions samatha by itself, or he mentions vipassana by itself, or he mentions the practice without saying samatha, or he mentions the practice without saying vipassana. So if we only study the suttas, it is impossible for us to know what is samatha and what is vipassana, because it's not explained anywhere. Then we can look at other explanations the Buddha gives in the suttas about what needs to be done. For example, the Buddha talks about the all, sabbang. Please read. The destruction of suffering is arahantship. Now, what does it mean? What does directly knowing mean? What does fully knowing mean? What does having dispassion for mean? What does abandoning mean? It's not explained in the suttas. But the Buddha does explain what the all is. So, and then the Buddha says the same thing about the tongue, etc., the body, etc., the mind, etc. And then, please read the last paragraph. This sutta is in the Sanyutta Nikaya. Then in other suttas we can find the Buddha say the same thing about the eye and sight base, the ear and sound base, the nose and odor base, the tongue and flavor base, the body and tangible base, and the mind and Dhamma base. That's 12 bases. And then again, in other suttas we can find the Buddha say the same thing with regard to the eye, sight and eye consciousness element, the ear, sound and ear consciousness element, the nose, odor and nose consciousness element, the body, tangible and body consciousness element, and the mind, Dhamma and mind consciousness element. That's 18 elements. Okay, now we can go back and then we can ask ourselves, what is the I? Right? The I, bhikkhus. What is the I? What is the difference between the I and the I element and the I base? Right? The Buddha says it needs to be fully understood. The Buddha also says the five aggregates need to be understood. Where is the I in the five aggregates? What is the connection between the I element, the I base, and the five aggregates? The Buddha says they need to be fully understood. Unfortunately, there's not a single sutta where the Buddha explains this. Right? He just says this needs to be done, but he doesn't explain the relationship between one teaching and another. Okay. One layman gave me a simile, which I'll give to you. Imagine you are in the kindergarten, right? And then the kindergarten teacher asks the little boy what the eye is. And the little boy points at his eye like this. This is my eye. Okay? Is that what we need to know to practice vipassana on the eye? If that is what we need to know to practice vipassana on the eye, then vipassana is a kindergarten concept. And then we don't need jhana. Then we need only a sevenfold path to nibbana. And then the Dhamma is self-evident, easy to see, easy to understand, trivial, conceptual, banal, attainable by mere inference and reasoning, simplistic and gross, to be experienced by children in the kindergarten. Right? That is if we think that this is the I. Right? Because even little children know what that I is. But the Buddha's understanding of the Dhamma is very different. It's not to be experienced by children in the kindergarten. This reflection is a reflection that the newly enlightened Buddha had. Right? He practiced samatha vipassana, he attained nibbana, and then he reflected. I thought, no, this is too difficult. I can't teach. This is impossible. People will not understand. And then the Buddha decided, I can't teach it. I won't teach. This is just after his enlightenment. And then Mahabrahma came down and said, no, please. There are people who can't understand. And then the Buddha looked into the world and he saw that people were like different types of lotus. Some lotuses are under the water. Some lotuses are just emerged from the surface. Some lotuses are free of the water. And he realized that some people can understand. And then he decided, okay, open other doors to the deathless. But when we reflect on that, then we may understand that the Dhamma is not easy. It's not easy to understand. It's not easy to practice. It's not easy to see. It's not easy to attain. It's not easy to realize. It's very, very difficult. Even children in the kindergarten, they know, right? If you put your finger on your eye, you can feel your finger. You can feel the touch of your finger. But children in the kindergarten do not know that according to the Buddha, touch is not cognized by the eye base. Touch is cognized by the body base. Right? Then where's the eye base? Right? You touch your finger, your eye, you can feel your finger. That's the body base. Then where's the eye base? It's not explained anywhere in the suttas. If we study the suttas, we can find the Buddha many, many times. He explains that the elements and the internal and external bases, they need to be known and seen for there to be enlightenment. But we cannot find the Buddha explain what is the I element. We cannot find him explain what is the I base. Even if we study the sutras for 1,000 years, we're not going to find such things explained in any sutta, right? But the Buddha says that nama rupa, right? Nama rupa pachaya sarayatana. Mind matter are the condition for the 6 bases. So if we don't know what the 6 bases are, how can we understand dependent origination? Right? Nama rupa pachaya sarayatana is one of the factors of dependent origination. If we don't know what the 6 bases are, how can we understand dependent origination? We can't. We can't find the information necessary in a sutta because it's not sutta material. If we go to the computer shop to buy a banana, we will not succeed in our endeavor. Why? Why? Yes. Very good. Computer shops do not sell bananas. So if we think we can get enlightened by going only to the suttas, we will not succeed in our endeavor. Because the suttas do not give detailed information regarding the ultimate realities that the Buddha refers to. If we look only at the suttas, we can impossibly know and see the ultimate realities that the Buddha discusses. And if we do not know and see the ultimate realities discussed by the Buddha, we cannot attain Nibbana. Right? This is what you just read aloud. We can give another example. The 5 aggregates. The 5 aggregates are not peripheral to the Buddha's teachings. They are central to the Buddha's teachings. And the Buddha explains very clearly throughout his teaching that the 5 aggregates must be known and seen for there to be enlightenment. For example, okay, right? Then the same perception, formations and consciousness. The 5 aggregates need to be directly known, fully known. One needs to develop dispassion for them. They need to be abandoned. Otherwise, one cannot attain Nibbana. If we read the suttas, we may know on a superficial level what the Buddha means by the aggregates. For example, he explains the Rupa Kanda as the 4 great essentials: earth element, water element, fire element, and wind element. And then he explains it as derived matter. Right? The 4 great essentials, Patavi Dhatu, Apo Dhatu, Teju Dhatu, Vayu Dhatu. And then derived materiality, or derived matter. But the Buddha does not explain anywhere in the suttas how we see those things. He does not even explain what derived matter is. Right? So the Buddha explains the materiality aggregate needs to be known and seen, fully known, etc. And then he explains the materiality aggregate is the 4 great essentials and derived matter. He doesn't explain how to do it, and he doesn't explain what derived matter is in the suttas. Now, if we have not known and seen the 4 great essentials and derived matter, then we cannot know what the materiality aggregate is, what the matter aggregate is. It's impossible. And then we cannot attain Nibbana, because the Buddha says it's impossible. Then we can look at sensation, right? Or feeling. Some people translate it feeling, some people translate it sensation, Vedana. We can see, what does the Buddha say about sensation? Now, if we study the sutras, we can find out the different types of numbers of sensations that the Buddha explains. For example, we can understand that when the Buddha says he explains 108 kinds of sensation, it's 36 kinds of sensation in the past, 36 in the future, and 36 in the present. But in practice, and how do we know the difference between perception and sensation? How do we differentiate in theory and practice between sensation, perception, and consciousness? Right? Sensation is the second of the five aggregates, perception is the third of the five aggregates, and consciousness is the fifth of the five aggregates. How do we differentiate between them, both in theory and in practice? Because sensation arises together with perception and consciousness. So that means there are two kinds of perception, there are three kinds of perception, there are five kinds of perception, there are six kinds of perception, there are 18 kinds of perception, there are 36 kinds of perception, 108 kinds of perception, and the same consciousness. How do we distinguish? In the sutras it's explained that they arise together. But how do we distinguish between the various mental formations, the various mental factors, not explained in any sutta? And then the different kinds of consciousness that the Buddha says we must know and see, right? Earlier, you read that the Buddha says we must know the eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and mind consciousness. But in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, the Buddha also says the bhikkhu must know a consciousness associated with lust, a consciousness dissociated from lust, a consciousness associated with hatred, a consciousness dissociated from hatred, consciousness associated with delusion, dissociated from delusion, contracted consciousness, distracted consciousness, exalted consciousness, unexalted consciousness, surpassed consciousness, unsurpassed consciousness, concentrated consciousness, unconcentrated consciousness, liberated consciousness, and unliberated consciousness. Because the Buddha says you need to know according to the Mahasatipatthana Sutta. What does it mean? The Buddha doesn't explain what it means. Maybe by studying for a very long time we can work some of them out. But how do we see them? How do we distinguish them? And how do we practice? It's not explained in any sutta. The Buddha just says the bhikkhu knows these things. And then he knows them internally, he knows them externally, and he knows them internally and externally. What does internally and externally mean? Let's take the next explanation. The Buddha says the same thing for feelings, perceptions, formations, and consciousness. Now, why does the Buddha call them the five aggregates? Aggregate means a collection. For example, you're a collection of an aggregate of people. This is an aggregate of fingers. So why does the Buddha talk about the materiality aggregate? Do you know? because they are this collection, past, future, present, internal, right? 11 different types of materiality. That is why it's called an aggregate, why the Buddha calls it an aggregate. So when the Buddha says we need to know and see the 5 aggregates, he means that we need to know and see these 11 types of 5 aggregates. Right? That means we need to know and see 55 aggregates with direct knowledge, with right wisdom. But if we study only the suttas, we cannot find the Buddha explain those 11 types. Those 11 types are mentioned in many, many suttas. Nowhere explained in the suttas. So, if we don't know what they mean, how are we going to practice? Past, future, present, right? Past aggregates, future aggregates, present aggregates. The Buddha doesn't explain how to see past aggregates. Sayadaw U Khyentse explained to you this afternoon how to see them. But he didn't get the information from a sutta because it's not explained in any sutta whatsoever. And we cannot, as Sayadaw U Khyentse explained to you, you cannot practice vipassana on inference. Right? Cannot just say, oh, as it is in this life, so it was in the past life, and so it will be in the future. No, it has to be seen with direct knowledge. Right? Because the Buddha says it has to be seen with right wisdom. And the Buddha says the 5 aggregates need to be known and seen directly and fully. Right? The 5 aggregates is the 5 groupings of 11 types of each. The Buddha explains this very clearly to a bhikkhu called Kachana. A wanderer called Kachana. Please read. We cannot know the past 5 aggregates or see the future 5 aggregates by inference because we cannot practice vipassana on inference. Thus it is impossible for us to know and see and practice vipassana according to the Buddha's instructions in the suttas because they simply aren't there. Right? It would be fantasy for us to practice. It would be Harry Potter. Let's try to understand this further by investigating the 5 aggregates as they explain in the suttas. The 5 aggregates are formations, right? Sankhara. Because there's only one unformed phenomenon. That's Nibbana. Everything else is formed. And the 5 aggregates are Rupakanda, matter aggregate. Matter is formations of matter. Matter is formations of matter. Right? Material formations. Then we have the sensation aggregate, Vedana Kanda. That's formations of mind. Then we have the perception aggregate. That's formations of mind. Then we have the consciousness aggregate. That's formations of mind. And then we have the formations aggregate. What's that? The 5 aggregates are formations of matter, rupa, and mind, nama. They can't be formations of anything else. So what is the difference between the formations of sensation, perception, and consciousness, and then formations of formations? Can we find the answer explained in a sutta? yes, the Buddha explains that it's volition. But in many sutras, the Buddha explains other things like contact, volition, applied thought, sustained thought. Those are mental factors. Where do they belong in the five aggregates? The Buddha doesn't explain that anywhere in the sutras. So, can we, by studying the sutras, sit down in meditation and know and see the phenomena of each aggregate? We can't. And if we can't, how can we practice? We can only get sort of, it's vague conceptual knowledge which can lead to nothing, right? We can just sit and sort of, it must be this or maybe it's that. That does not lead to vipassana insight knowledge. And that means it's impossible for us to attain Nibbana. Then what are we to do? The Buddha said it on his deathbed. What does the Buddha say there? Dhamma Vinaya. The Buddha doesn't say suttas and Vinaya. He says Dhamma Vinaya. Where do we find the Dhamma today? No, this doesn't work. The way, please come and help me. What? What? There. Yes, close. Okay. What is the Dhamma? Right, now the Buddha passed away. This he said to the Venerable Ananda shortly before he passed away, because the Venerable Ananda said to the Buddha, now what we will do, there will be no teacher. And the Buddha said, the Dhamma Vinaya will be your teacher. Where do we find the Dhamma today? We find it in the so-called three baskets. Ti Pitaka. Ti means three, Pitaka means basket. We can also just, right, that's a Pali word for it. We can also say three collections. Right, so we find the Dhamma not just in one basket, we find it not just in two baskets, we find it in three baskets. Then we can ask ourselves, did the Buddha arrange his teachings into the three baskets? What do you think? No. Did he organize all his teachings into groupings and collections and chapter and page and number? No. That is not the work of a Buddha. The Buddha explains in one sutta that he just speaks spontaneously. The Buddha is like a Dhamma machine. He doesn't organize anything. He just speaks spontaneously with his omniscient knowledge. Right? Now a Vinaya rule needs to be laid down, boom, lay down. Now this explanation needs to be given, explanation given. He doesn't organize anything. There's no thought about this is the Digha Nikaya, this is the Majjhima Nikaya, this is the Samyutta Nikaya. That's not the Buddha's business. So we cannot find the Buddha anywhere discussing semantics and grammar. We cannot find him discussing rhetoric. All the Buddha teaches, he says, is suffering and the end of suffering. Right? The king does not explain the procedure for filling out a form at the post office. The postmaster general doesn't do it. Not even the postmaster. It's the clerk who does it. And the clerks who organized the Dhamma were learned elders and arahants. Right? 500 arahants at the first council. The work of organizing the Abhidhamma was done by the Venerable Sariputta. He was chief of all disciples. He was second, the Buddha himself said he was second only to the Buddha. And the Buddha declared him as his foremost son. But he passed away before the Buddha did. Right? He died before the Buddha died. Mahamoggallana died before the Buddha died. The council was after the Buddha died. So that's why Venerable Sariputta was not involved in the first council. The first council was convened under the Venerable Mahakassapa. And then, how did they organize the body of teachings? They organized the teachings into three divisions: Vinaya, Sutta, and Abhidhamma. The Vinaya does not explain the Suttas and Abhidhamma, but it does refer to them. The Suttas do not explain the Vinaya and Abhidhamma, but the Suttas do refer to them. The Abhidhamma does not explain the Vinaya, but in each of the classifications, the Venerable Sariputta included a Suttanta classification. Right? First he gave the Abhidhamma classification, Abhidhamma Bhajaniya, and then he gave the Suttanta classification, Suttanta Bhajaniya. And this is because one needs to understand one teaching is according to conventional reality, the other teaching is according to ultimate reality. Right? And so one needs to understand the relationship between the two. That's how the Pali texts are organized. And that is how we receive them. That's not how the Buddha organized them, because he didn't organize them. He taught suffering and the end of suffering. So let's then look at the three divisions of the Pali texts. The Vinaya gives detailed explanations and analyses of the bhikkhu's discipline as explained by the Buddha. The bhikkhu's discipline as such is not explained and analyzed in the suttas, but if we study the suttas, we can find the Buddha say in many suttas that the bhikkhus must learn and practice the Vinaya in its entirety, and they must practice the Vinaya at all times. This Buddha says many times in the suttas. So, if we study the suttas, we understand that even though the suttas and the Vinaya are separate, in practice they cannot be separated. Because if one is an expert in the suttas, one will have read that the Buddha says one must be expert in the Vinaya, and that means one must then be an expert in the Vinaya as well. One can't say, oh, I handle money because I'm a sutta monk. That's impossible, because in the suttas the Buddha says the monk must be expert in the Vinaya. Right? So, if we are expert in the suttas, we must be expert in the Vinaya. Then we have the suttas. They discuss the procedure for the training. They discuss the practice. They are guidelines. That is the meaning of sutta. Sutta means a line, right? It's explained that the sutta is like when a carpenter wants to make sure that the wall is straight, then he hangs something heavy from a string, and that guides him. Then he knows what to do, how to cut, how to work the wood. And that is the meaning of sutta. It's a guideline. The suttas explain what needs to be done, what needs to be understood, in order that we may understand the Four Noble Truths and become enlightened. And by studying the suttas, we understand the whole structure of the path towards enlightenment. By studying the suttas, we understand that as bhikkhus we must observe the Vinaya very strictly. We understand that we must meditate. We understand that we must study. And that we must know the meaning in theory and practice of, for example, the 18 elements, the 12 bases, the 5 aggregates, etc. And to understand the 18 elements, the 12 bases, the 5 aggregates, etc., means we will have to study the Abhidhamma, because, as I just explained, those things are not explained in the suttas. It just says that we have to know them, we have to see them, we have to know what they are, but it doesn't say what they are. We can find that only in the suttas. So, when we study the suttas, there are many things we don't know. And then we can refer to learned elders of the past. They are the ones who speak in the commentaries, the sub-commentaries, and even in the sub-sub-commentaries. Until we are enlightened, our understanding that this procedure needs to be followed is governed by our faith in the Buddha, our faith in the threefold procedure that he gives in the suttas: morality, concentration, and wisdom. Right? So that's an explanation of what the Vinaya is, what the sutras are, and then we have the Abhidhamma. The Abhidhamma discusses ultimate reality, the ultimate elements of mind and matter in all their different combinations, in their different relations, as they were seen and explained by the Buddha. Right? The Buddha saw it on his night of the enlightenment. He reflected on it later on, and then later on again he went to the Devaloka and taught the Abhidhamma, and then every day he went down and explained what he had taught to the Venerable Sariputta, who then organized it. Right? So, if we want to know what the elements and bases and aggregates are, we do not go to the Vinaya, we do not go to the Sutras, we need to go to the Abhidhamma. That is where they explained. If we want bananas, where do we go? We go to the fruit market or the fruit shop. If we want a computer, we go to the computer shop. It's not very difficult to understand that. Then, what do we do if we want to put all these things that we know into practice? Right? We want to bring the concepts to life. There's a vast body of commentaries composed by learned bhikkhus of the past. They explain the practice in detail, from their own experience and from the experience of others. What was the source of their practice? The Buddha's enlightened instructions. How did these commentaries come about? At the first council, the texts were divided into 3 divisions and then allotted to groups of learned bhikkhus to recite order. Right? So that they had all these teachings, and then they say, okay, now you organize these, you do these, you do these, you do these, you do these. So, we have what's called the reciters of the Digha Nikaya. That's called the Digha Bhanaka. The reciters of the Majjhima Nikaya, the Majjhima Bhanaka. The reciters of the Samyutta Nikaya, the Samyutta Bhanaka, and the reciters of the Anguttara Nikaya, Anguttara Bhanaka. Then when we study the commentaries to those various Nikayas, we can see that other commentaries are referred to, right? They refer to each other. And sometimes their explanation is different, but it's only according to the letter, not according to the meaning. Because sometimes this group of bhikkhus, they explain it from this angle, right? The Digha Bhanaka and maybe the Samyutta Bhanaka, they explain it from this angle, and then the Majjhima Bhanaka, maybe they explain it from another angle. But if one is learned, one can see that it's all 3 angles of the same thing. And then, if we study all the commentaries, all the sutras, then we can see that they all agree with each other. Right? They coincide and agree with each other. They do not diverge with regard to the chief matter. The distinctions we need to make between one explanation and another are sometimes very subtle and very difficult to see. Sometimes very difficult to understand what's the difference between the letter and the spirit. Then, if we don't have enough faith, then we may think, oh no, this is rubbish. Or this is no good. This is not true. Or then we don't understand this is different from this, and this is different from that, and that is different from that. So, problems. What are the problems? Why does this happen? Because of insufficient understanding and knowledge about what the Buddha means in the suttas. Right? And this is not only the bhikkhus, because now there are many, many, many lay people who teach, especially in the West. In the West they don't like bhikkhus, right? And then they don't understand what the Buddha really means in the suttas, and then we get this kind of problem. But if we have faith, and we refer to what the learned elders of the past explained in the commentaries, right? The venerable teachers of the commentaries, Atthakatha Acharya, they explain to us how to understand the suttas, how to put them into practice. They are what the Buddha calls the watering place for us to drink, enthusiasm for the meaning, and for us to find what the Buddha calls Dhamma-related joy. Because the venerable commentary teachers are what the Buddha calls and what do they do in the commentaries? They help us. And then we can ask, who is better to explain the suttas? The bhikkhus who recited the suttas at the first council, who organized them into the 3 baskets, who composed the different books, who still had the sound of the Buddha's voice in their ears? Did they not know what the suttas meant? Were they not the first and foremost equipped to apply the 4 great references? And if we study the commentaries, we cannot take the 4 great references and apply it to the suttas and say it doesn't match. It cannot be reconciled. And then we can ask ourselves again, right? The first council was just after the Buddha's parinibbana. The place is swarming with arahants. Is it all finished after the first council? Has everything been said? Of course not. Right? There are many, many learned arahants. They have a lot to say. Right? Many of them maybe live for 20, 30 years, maybe 40 years, 50 years. Venerable Ananda lived until he was 120 years old. They have a lot to say, still. It's not all over with the first council. The first council was established merely to make sure we've got it all. Right? We've got what's necessary. There's still a lot more to be said, still a lot more to be explained. And that's what's in the commentaries. And that continued for hundreds of years until one point they decided, okay, now we're not going to add any more. So, if we want to understand the Dhamma, if we want to be able to apply the 4 great references, if we want to know what is the Dhamma and what is not the Dhamma, we need to turn to the learned ones, not to ourselves, not to our own ideas. Because they know what they're talking about. We can't just refer to our own understanding, our own logic, etc. Because the Buddha says the Dhamma cannot be understood by mere inference. And when the commentaries explain the Dhamma in the commentaries, they refer very often to something called the Patisambhida Magga. Venerable Sayadaw U Kanzai mentioned it today. It's called, in English, it's the discrimination path. That is a completely practical work. It explains the path of discrimination in various aspects. It explains in detail how understanding takes place. And the author is the Venerable Sariputta. It is thrilling to read. It's very, very exciting to read. But if we don't have faith, if we say, that's not by the Venerable Sariputta, that's not the Dhamma, then it's very boring. Then the second very important work is the purification path, the Visuddhimagga. It explains the 3-fold training of morality, concentration and wisdom. And if you look at it, morality and concentration take up this much, and wisdom takes up almost the same. The wisdom section is the biggest of the three sections. That is also a very practical work. And when one studies it in relation to the Vinaya and the Suttas, one begins to understand them. It refers all the time to the Abhidhamma because it's talking about the practice. Because to practice, one needs to know what things one is looking at, what things one is studying in one's meditation. There's no single author to the Visuddhimagga because it was compiled by a group of bhikkhus under the Venerable Buddhaghosa, taken from various sources. If we study in this way, using the commentaries, using the Paticambiddhamagga, using the Visuddhimagga, then everything becomes clear. If we don't, then everything is grey, vague and difficult to understand. And then when we sit down to meditate, there's no object. Right? It's just, what now? But if we practice the Buddha's instructions under a teacher of great learning, versed in the doctrine, master of the Dhamma, master of the Vinaya, master of the matrices, then all the time his instructions, we can refer them to the Visuddhimagga, the Paticambiddhamagga, the commentaries, sub-commentaries, sub-sub-commentaries. Everything is explained, right? Because first of all, the commentaries, Visuddhimagga is also a commentary. Then a long time passed, and then people were beginning not to understand the commentaries, right? They understand this, but then what does this mean? Because longer and longer time has passed since the Buddha passed away. Then they make the sub-commentaries to explain the commentary. And then more time passes, and then there are things they don't understand the sub-commentary. Then they make the sub-sub-commentary to explain the sub-commentary, right? And that's why very often when you study, first you study the sutta, and then what does this mean? Then you go to the commentary. It means this. Oh, but what does this mean? Then you go to the sub-commentary. It means this. Oh, but what's this? Then you go to the sub-commentary. Right? And then the commentary will throughout explain, this, if you want an explanation of this, look at this sutta. And if you want an explanation of that, go to that Vinaya. And if you want an explanation of this, go to the Abhidhamma. And right, always many references to suttas, Vinaya and Abhidhamma. In the Visuddhimagga, some of the chapters, they explain. Then at the end of the chapter they say, if you want any suttas, just look here. Right? So everything is explained, everything is very clear. And this is necessary for there to be a proper practice. I don't know how many of you have practiced, but you try to practice, for example, what did the Sayadaw U Council explain today? It was Paccaya Parigaha Jnana, right? The cause apprehension knowledge about Paticca and last time it was Nama-rupa Paricheda Jnana, right? Now you try to do Nama-rupa Paricheda Jnana and now try to understand mentality, materiality just by sitting there and looking at your mind. You can't see anything, right? You don't know what's what. So that's my introductory explanation about what we need to do to understand what is the true Dhamma. What we need to do in order to apply a reference, right? We get a teaching, is this a Dhamma Vinaya? We need to refer to those who know, which is the commentary teachers. Or we can refer to somebody like the Venerable Sayadaw U Council, because he has studied all those things, he's learned it, and then you can go and ask him, what does he do? What does the Paul Sayadaw do? Open the computer, look, because they never speak just from their own idea. They always refer to the text. Why? To preserve the sasana. Then we can ask, can there be any doubt about this? Yes. There's a vast, ancient, and ever-thriving cult of doubt about this. It's not new. It's very old. It's not just in the West, it's also in the East. And as Buddhism, as it's called, spreads throughout the world, this doubt spreads more and more and more. More and more ideas, more and more different teachings, more and more confusion. Right? As the Buddhism spreads, confusion spreads about the Dhamma. So let's look at some of the objections. One of the most common objections is that, one of the most common objections is that the suttas give explanations of people getting enlightened without learning all these things, right? They don't learn about the 5 aggregates, they don't learn about the 18 elements, they don't learn about the 12 bases, they don't learn about the Abhidhamma, they don't learn about all this, right? The Buddha just gives them a sentence and then bing, they're enlightened. So, the objection is, well then why do we need to learn all that? Right? The Dhamma is not very difficult. Well, I've just explained it all. You've read a number of suttas where the Buddha says what's necessary to become enlightened. And that's what we do. When we hear an objection like that, then we know, but the Buddha says you need to know this, you need to know this, you need to be directly known, fully known, this and this and this. So, this objection is invalid. That's an application of the Buddha's advice about the 4 great references. So, not only bhikkhu, also layman, laywoman, right? Another objection is that many suttas are corrupted, that they came later, that the Abhidhamma, the Visuddhimagga, the commentaries are all just metaphysics added by corrupt bhikkhus of, right? Many they say that the bhikkhus who wrote the commentaries and wrote the Visuddhimagga, they were Brahmins, right? And they just want to make things more difficult than they really need to be. Right? Then the word Abhidhamma, right? Many Abhidhamma, they don't want to hear the word, they don't like it. Commentaries, right? Very often, oh, is that in the commentaries? Yes. Right? Rubbish. Then again, this comes from very often single teachers. It comes from professors from this and that university. It comes from many different academics. They publish many different articles, and then they discuss and explain that the commentaries and etc. they're just legend, speculation, fantasy, and then they explain only a small collection of the Pali texts are the pure original Dhamma. Have you heard this? Have you heard this? Yes or no? It is, even in Singapore you can find it. Even in Thailand, in Myanmar maybe not so much, in Sri Lanka, in Vietnam, a lot of places in Asia, in the West, right? Only a few, the rest is corruption. We read the translations that are in English, read the endnotes, it comes again and again and again. This explanation is wrong, this explanation is a later addition, this sutta is corrupt, according to Professor blah 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 from this and this university, according to Professor Sing Sing Sing, according to this university, right? That's how this faith, this cult of doubt has spread throughout the world and is gaining more and more adherents. And what does it mean? It means that the Venerable Elders didn't know what they were talking about. Then what do we do with such a statement? We remind ourselves that the suttas were compiled at the first council, they were compiled and redacted by the Sangha, not the Buddha, and then we can just very easily refer to the said statements, to the suttas and Vinaya. And then we can ask ourselves, Is there just a small core of original teachings and the rest is just corrupt and has nothing to do with anything, is unnecessarily complicated? No. The Buddha does not monopolize knowledge of the Dhamma. Right? The Dhamma is independent of the Buddha. The Buddha is not the Dhamma because it comes from the Buddha's mouth. The Dhamma is the Dhamma because it is the Dhamma. Right? The Buddha pays respect to the Dhamma. It's something apart from him. And who it comes from is irrelevant. That's what the four great references are. Because the Buddha says it can come from the Buddha, it can come from a Sangha, it can come from a collection of elders, and it can come from a single elder. Right? So anybody can utter Dhamma, even though it doesn't come from straight from the Buddha. The Buddha, in many, many places, he praises other people for their wisdom, including non-arahants. He praises single utterances by others, including non-arahants. We can take an example. King Pasenadi of Kosala. The texts nowhere say that he attained any magga or phala, any path of fruition. But a number of suttas explain that King Pasenadi is thinking about something, and then he goes to the Buddha and says, I was just thinking this and this and this. And then the Buddha says, so it is, Your Majesty, so it is. Right? Very good, correct. And then the Buddha repeats what the king says, and the Buddha adds a summarizing verse. And on the night of his death, King Pasenadi called upon the Buddha, right, the night of the king's death. He visited the Buddha, he worshipped the Buddha with great love and honor, and then the Buddha asked him, why do you worship me in this way? And then the king gave 10 very beautiful explanations. And then he left, and he died that night. And when the king left, after having given these 10 explanations of why he worshipped the Buddha with great love and reverence, the Buddha said to the Sangha, the Buddha told the bhikkhus to learn, master and remember Dhamma taught by an unenlightened man like the King Pasenadi. How is that possible? It's possible because the authenticity of the Dhamma does not depend on who utters it. The Dhamma is a Dhamma whether it's uttered or not uttered. The Dhamma is a Dhamma before a Buddha hears of it or approves of it. The Dhamma is a Dhamma while a Buddha hears and approves of it. The Dhamma is a Dhamma after he has heard and approved of it. And the Dhamma is a Dhamma even if the Buddha has not heard it or approved of it. We can take another example. One bhikkhu, Bhumija, he was asked by Prince Jayasena. The prince asked him, can one attain a fruit from one's practice whether one aspires to it or not, right? One can practice and then one can aspire, I want to attain this result from my practice. The prince's question was, can one attain the result without aspiring to that? And the Venerable Bhumija explained that if one practiced badly, one would attain no results, whether one aspired to them or did not aspire to them. On the other hand, if one practiced well, one would attain the results whether one aspired to them or not. And then the Venerable Bhumija said to the prince, then the Venerable Bhumija went to the Buddha. He just wanted to make sure, did I say what was correct? And the Buddha said, So we can understand again that Dhamma is not only the Dhamma because it comes from the Buddha's mouth, the Dhamma is the Dhamma because it's the Dhamma. Then we have another last objection. I'm giving you these objections because these objections one comes across everywhere. And it's good to know why they are wrong. Because many, they say, I have faith in the power of sadhu, I have faith in the Abhidhamma and the Visuddhimagga, and then, but I also have faith in this teacher who says the opposite, and this teacher who says something completely different, and this teacher who says something even more different. And then confusion arises. And very often it's because of not understanding that this teaching is incorrect. And that's why we're talking about the four great references. Because if one looks up to many teachers, problem. Because one can't be sure of where one's going, then it's very difficult to maintain one's practice. And the most common objection is that the sutras and Vinaya, right, they're all corrupt. We can't be sure about them anymore. Was this really what the Buddha said? Was this really what happened? Did Angulimala really kill so many people? Etc., etc., etc. Right? Many learned professors make money out of explaining that this is wrong and this is wrong and this is wrong and this is wrong. And then it goes on the internet and it's published and people read it and then a lot of doubt arises. Right? The Abhidhamma was not taught by the Buddha. Okay. Now let us imagine that the Abhidhamma was not taught by the Buddha. Then we remove it. Then we have a Dvipitaka. Right? Instead of Tipitaka, we have Dvipitaka. If we remove the Abhidhamma, then all the commentaries have to go. Because the commentaries always refer to the Abhidhamma. Because Abhidhamma explains ultimate reality. And then, all the sutras that refer to ultimate reality, right? 5 aggregates, 18 elements, 12 bases. There are also sutras where the Buddha talks about 3 elements and 2 elements and 5 elements and 7 elements, right? All those sutras also have to go, because we can't understand them. Then what's left? Just literature and poetry. What do we do with literature and poetry? We can't practice just according to literature and poetry. And then all we can do is just sit around. And then we teach kindergarten Dhamma. The eye, this is, right? The eye isn't even mentioned because we've removed it, right? And then we just talk about Sigalovada Sutta and about how not to gamble and not go drinking, and the moon rises behind a cloud, right? There's nothing left. There's nothing practical left. And then what do we end up doing? We ordain, and then very busy sweeping and chopping wood, celebrating, saying that this is a bhikkhu's life, making robes, dyeing robes, celebrating robes, making bowls, firing bowls, going for alms, eating alms food, washing the alms bowl, talking about that, raising funds for monasteries, for pagodas, statues, designing them, maintaining them, talking about them, right? Going through all these things that have nothing to do with the Dhamma, just material things. And this we see everywhere, right? We see it. Very, very busy with all sorts of things that do not make us heirs in the Dhamma. Why? Because just going for Pindabhata, just making robes, dyeing robes, building monasteries, all this, that does not lead to the end of birth, aging and death. It leads to the end of the true Dhamma. It leads to the end of the Buddha Sasana. So, we need to remember, if we call ourselves Buddhists, it's not a very good word, but it's the best we have, I suppose. If we call ourselves Buddhists, we take 3 refuges. And if our ordination as a bhikkhu is according to the Buddha's guidelines, then we will also have started by taking the 3 refuges. Right? To the Buddha for refuge I go, to the Dhamma for refuge I go, to the Sangha for refuge I go. So that's not 1 refuge, it's not 2, it's 3. It's laid down by the Buddha. And if we take any other refuge, then we can't call ourselves Buddhists, right? Because that is the foundation of being a Buddhist, it's the 3 refuges. The 3rd refuge is the Sangha. That means human beings in the past who ordained, but it means the Sangha of noble ones and arahants. Skilled men and women who saw and knew the 4 Noble Truths. First and foremost, those who associated with the Buddha. It was they who compiled the Pali texts. And over the subsequent 2,600 years, their followers learned and studied. Even today, still there are places, especially in Myanmar, where they learn those texts and then put them into practice the procedures laid down in the text with deference and gratitude. And many attained path and fruition. If they didn't attain a path and fruition, they accumulated many superior parami. Why? Because of faith in the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. Faith is the first stone of our path to Nibbana. It's the foundation stone of our refuge. But faith needs to go together with learning. If we have no learning, or just little learning, very easy to go astray. Because when there's little learning, we don't know whether this teaching can be reconciled with the suttas and Vinaya. Then on the opposite side, if we study the suttas and Vinaya and we have no faith or little faith, then we will find fault where there's no fault. We may dismiss teachings as corrupt simply because we don't understand it. And that's very dangerous. So there needs to be learning and faith together, and then whenever there's something we don't understand, we go to those who know. That's what the Buddha calls the drinking place. Sorry. This is what we do when we study the commentaries. We study the sutta. What is the I? Go to the commentary, get the answer, written by learned elders of the past. And then, doubts are clear, we know what to do. When we know the watering place, we may know what it is to have drunk. When we know what it is to have drunk, we may straighten our faith and prevent ourselves from being led astray. For then are we able to know whether a teaching comes under what we call the Dhamma Vinaya. Please remember, Christians, they know their Bible. Muslims, they know their Quran. How many here have got the Buddha's teachings on their bookcase at home? Right? If we want to prevent ourselves from going astray, we need to do like the Christians and the Muslims. We need to study, because our faith is very precious. And that is, next time I come to Singapore, that's what I shall discuss, how to protect our faith. Thank you.
Sorry, is there a questions and answer sessions? Sorry, Bhante.
Well, it's a bit late and you've listened to 2 Dharma talks, so maybe you're very tired. It's up to you. Up to you.
Okay, brother and sister, any questions? Okay, thank you, Bhante.